Hey everyone, and welcome to Painting Sigvald Part 2. And in this one, we're going to focus on painting the cloak, which hopefully some of you are excited about. I think it's one of the things people seem to like the most on the paint job. And I've painted this entirely with airbrush, so this is also kind of a tutorial on how to paint cloaks with airbrush. I actually did this before painting Eltharion, and so when I painted Eltharion I had that in mind, and that's why I did that tutorial with just brush. And then if you remember the lion tutorial, the part of the cloak, we actually combined airbrush with the brush. So I hope between those three tutorials you've got good examples of just airbrush, just brush, and the combination, and it shows that you don't have to have those tools and you can get a good result anyway. It's just different. This was the fastest, of course, it's just airbrushed, and the most straightforward. I do love it, but I also like all the little intricacies that we achieved on Eltharion's cloak. This one works particularly well for just airbrush because it's so big and the folds are very open. The ones in Eltharion are tighter, so it just made sense. But yeah, I'd love to know what you think of those three tutorials and the three approaches. And it's always my intention to give you options, different ways to paint stuff, and show that there's no one way to do things, and I always try different ways. Throughout the process, I used a bunch of colours. As always, it's trial and error. And the colours I used, I don't think you have to use them all. Screamer Pink is the main one that I used. This forms the important magenta tone that we achieved. And I tried highlighting it with magenta. This is a very powerful saturated colour. And when I used it for highlights, it was, well, too saturated. So in the end, I ended up adding ivory with the Screamer Pink. You could actually just use plain white, that would be fine. Similarly, I used Hasta Purple from Scale 75 for the shadows, and I didn't think I needed to use this actually. It didn't turn out dark enough, as you'll see, and I ended up using some black red added to it to form the shadows. I think I would skip this colour altogether, skip the magenta, and keep the recipe to just these paints here. So black red, Screamer Pink, and either ivory or white. Black red's not even super necessary. I think you would get some fine results with just paint black, but just having that slightly richer shadow probably will look pretty nice. Now, I often see people saying you can't add white into colours, and that's simply not true. You just need to understand what it does. When we add white, it will desaturate, so it will kill some of this colour. But actually for the cloak, this is what we want, because if it was too vibrant, then it would draw the eye away from the gold and the rest of the features. When I added magenta, it was too saturated. So actually, I got a better result by adding in some white. We're not adding much white to get highlights, so it's fine. If we were adding a lot of white, then maybe it would look too bleached out. But in this case, it worked great. So in conclusion, this is the recipe I went for in the end, and how simple is that? What I've done with the editing is I've left the whole process in there with all the candid footage, and I'll talk about my thoughts I had at the time. And at the end, I'm going to do a summary of what would be a more concise way to achieve this cloak. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, let me know how you find it. So this is the second time I'm going to be doing the pre-highlight on this model. That's because I had to re-sand down the cloak as I didn't quite sand it perfect. But hopefully this is where I had the problem. Hopefully you can see it's pretty damn smooth now. It's quite a lot of effort getting rid of those emblems, so for some of you it might not be worth it. I've actually glued the cloak on now. I definitely wanted the head separate, but I've gone for this glued on because I was just struggling to attach it to stuff. And as a little bit of a disclaimer, I have a deadline for this figure, and that means I have to paint it a little faster. So there are some ways I'm going to cut corners, and it's not going to be a massive compromise. It's still going to look cool, but yeah, it's probably I'd like to spend a little bit longer on it, basically, if I was doing it for something like Golden Demon. But on the other hand, it's quite fun to have this deadline and just make it look awesome without spending forever on it. I don't know about you, but there's so many miniatures I want to paint, so actually, you know, doing this in a few weeks instead of a couple months is quite a fun thing. So yeah, but that's kind of what we're going for. So to save some time, I want to do the cloak pretty much entirely with the airbrush, just because it's such a big old space that if I can pretty much finish it with the airbrush and then do all of the non-metallic stuff with the brush on its own, that'll be the compromise and save me the time. When it comes to things like non-metallic metal, there's all these little tiny highlights and volumes, and you just can't really airbrush it, in my opinion, and get the same feel. Whereas with the cloth, it's a very large open area and it should have soft highlights on it. So that's actually where the airbrush comes into its own, and so I think it's the appropriate tool for this. I'm pretty much just gonna spray these two cloths quite dark, and actually the only one that really matters is the top part, so that's where I'm also saving the time. If I wanted to do this to my best ability, I would do it separately and I would do it by hand, but I'd probably spend a couple weeks on these bits of cloth on their own. So anyway, so as usual, we've got Tamiya flat white loaded in a brush. You can kind of see where my lights are hitting the satin black and what we're aiming for with the highlights, and our light direction is from here. So just check the brush is working on the paper. So notice how I put this highlight right here in the bottom part of the fold, and that is where it's going to catch light, because this is still perpendicular to the light even though it comes down into a recess. I've got my Tamiya flat white fairly diluted, so as usual we can just build up that white gradually. All these folds are kind of covered by the hair, so I'll just spray those. But I don't need to build up the intensity on that. You can see how fast this is dealing with all these folds with the airbrush. So these parts are where I really want to build the intensity, because they're going to catch all the light. So the underside and the lower cloak's a funny one, because it's not going to get that much light because it's obviously covered, but we still need to have some highlights on it. So again, I'll highlight it with the airbrush, but I probably won't push the intensity to really bright white. So this side, I need to catch the bottom. Like this. And then from the other side, this is kind of more open and visible, so I think I'll actually come in from this angle and go this way. It's actually a really nice sculpt on the cloak. Like the folds are really good. Like these little ones in here are awesome, and then the big ones. I'd love to know who the sculptor is, because for me it feels like a bit of a step up. actually really fun airbrushing this, just because it's so nicely designed. Like, look at all those shadows. And we're spraying from that one direction. Super cool. So yeah, the lower cloak, that's a tricky one. I think I'll actually come in from both sides, just so it looks good from whichever angle you kind of look at. So I'll focus along here, as the light could probably get in there. And then on the other side, this top part here. Oops, so there I sprayed too long, and there's too much paint, and that's why it's kind of spread. But any mistakes like that are fine, we can soften that and blend that in. Okay, I'm probably going to go over those highlights another time or two. I've got to let it dry and build up the intensity. This is bright enough on the bottom, I think, but I've got a couple mistakes like here to fix. And yeah, looking really cool. Hopefully we can make this work as well with the colour over the top. This is where I ended up with the pre-highlight. On the screen maybe it looks like it's mostly white, but there's definitely a decent amount of shadow in there. I think the transition gets a little lost in the camera. Anyway, we've got a nice potential for good colours here. And there's the back, looking pretty awesome. So we're going for purple, the traditional Slanesh colours. And what I've decided to try is Screamer Pink over this pre-highlight. It's fairly dark, but maybe considered a mid-tone. And then if it needs to be darker, I think I'll use this Scale Hastro Purple. It doesn't look that dark in the bottle, but when you kind of build up the layers, it's quite a nice strong shadow. If I do need to go darker, then I'll pick something else. And I always use Vallejo Magenta, and I'm going to give the AK version a go. So the Vallejo one is awesome. It's really powerful and has amazing coverage for a magenta. Normally they're quite weak. But it is a very glossy paint and it doesn't airbrush well. In general, I've found these AK paints to be almost a spot-on match for colour, but they just perform a little better. So we'll give this one a try. So I've got Screamer Pink loaded in the airbrush. I'm going to start really diluted because we don't really know what the coverage is like. It is a base paint. I don't like using these Citadel air paints. And yeah, you just need to dilute them and they'll go through no problem. So I'm going to do like a light coverage and we'll just see how it looks. So I'm being really careful not to get it too saturated because then it will spread and ruin everything. So we're just dusting over. So the first pass isn't doing a lot, but we can see that second one will. so there you go. That's quite a few layers of Screamer Pink, and it's pretty opaque now. You can still see the pre-highlight a little bit, and you might be wondering, why do that elaborate pre-highlight and then make it almost fully opaque? And there's a few reasons. The first one for me is it's really hard to replicate with a brush the translucent Screamer Pink over white, because there's just so many variables, like how translucent was the paint, how many layers did you do. So if I make it opaque, I do have a chance of, if I need to make any mistakes with the correct any mistakes with the brush, then I've got a chance because I can use that opaque Screamer Pink on the brush. The other reason is we don't want to see any of the speckling from the pre-highlight, and I often think if you go too translucent, you can see the dots from the airbrushing before. So it's just to get a smoother result in the end, and you get a nicer colour over the white, so it is worth it. You can see subtle variations, and it's not crazy, but for the time it takes, I still think it's worth it. So I'm going to try the Hastur Purple out now. It's not much darker than the Screamer Pink, so we'll see. I might need to add something to make it darker, and I'm just going to shadow or try and spray along where these shadows are, so we're just trying to enhance these. And then I'll come from this direction and try and hit all these little folds. So I'm going to build that up and we'll see how it dries and if it's dark enough. So I've done a couple layers and it's not really dark enough what I'm looking for. It's made the tone really nice though, just slightly alters it. It's a little bit more saturated than the Screamer Pink, and that's why I went with the Screamer Pink first, because I actually didn't want this purple to be too saturated, too bright. It'll take away from the gold. Even though it's purple, we still want him to be kind of evilish, so a super bright one won't really suit it. So I think what I'm going to do is add something like black red to the Hastur Purple, and what that's doing is darkening it, but we're controlling the saturation of the colour. So if I add something like black, it will make it darker, but it will really, really desaturate it probably too much. I don't know what my autofocus is doing right now. So yeah, I'm just going to try adding a little bit of black red, and I know what this colour's like, super dark, and the right kind of saturation I'm looking for. And we'll add these two together and see if that's enough contrast. Maybe I could use pure black red, but I think these two together will work. Okay, so shadows, take two. Hastur Purple and a little bit of black red. So let's start along this path. Just carefully spraying that on, letting it dry, and we'll see what the colour's like. Sorry for my compressor noise, I find it quite annoying, so maybe you do too, maybe you don't mind. So that is definitely dark enough, that looks awesome. So let's roll that out. Careful not to ruin the highlights, but let's get those shadows. You can see it's kind of a little satin though. Look how shiny it is there. So we'll definitely give this a matte varnish, and the matte will make it not as dark. So it maybe looks a little too dark at the moment, but once we've hit the matte varnish, it should be okay. That black-red coverage is really good, so I'm only doing one pass and it's kind of already done, so yeah, that's something to be careful with. I actually tested it out on the back here. You can see that's super nice and dark. definitely get the underside of here. Okay, I'll check that over, and we're going to do some little highlights and then glaze them in, but yeah, it's not far off. Loving that model. Crazy cool. You might find at this point that it's finished to you. I want to add some more highlights, but there's no reason why you couldn't be done at this stage. It looks really great. I just want to build these highlights back up and just adjust the tones and the volumes, and it's always a little bit of a back and forth process for me. So I've gone back to Screamer Pink, our base coat, this one, and we're adding in a little bit of magenta at a time. So I've started out with a tiny bit of magenta added in, and we'll see how bright that is, and just work up from there. So I'm just going to go over the highlights, make sure that they're a nice tone. So you can make them brighter but also adjust the widths if your shadows kind of made them a little thin. They look about right to me. But I want to see if we can get that pop like we did on the pre-highlight. So we've got the cloth at the front here. I kind of forgot to do it. So I've sprayed it the dark colour. I'm just going to go from this angle and try and catch the tops. I'll probably end up doing that with brush, to be honest, just to get the control, but might as well have a go with the airbrush. I don't actually like the tone of that. I preferred it when it was more the Screamer Pink, more subtle tone. So I think I'm going to load up the Screamer Pink and just go over that. And then I might add a little white to the Screamer Pink to go lighter. You remember when we add white, it actually desaturates colours, but that's what I think I want. I want it to be relatively desaturated. And I think that's why I don't like this magenta, as it's become a little bit too vibrant. So yeah, I'm going to go over it with the Screamer Pink. Then I'll add some white and we'll see what that looks like. Okay, Screamer Pink with a little bit of ivory in, and let's see what this looks like. And I'm going to try and do these highlights nice and tight. Okay, that seems about right. I think I'll add a tiny bit more ivory and push it a little more, and then hopefully I'll just glaze that in, and we'll be done. But I like this more desaturated highlight rather than the vibrant pink. That wasn't working for me. So I highlighted with a little more ivory in, and it's really bleached out now, but we've got nice popping highlights. So it's been quite a back and forth process, this cloak, and that's pretty much how I work with everything. When I've finished it, maybe I'll kind of write a better order to do things. Obviously, I'm kind of experimenting along the way, but I'm sure we're going to get an awesome result in the end. It's just going back and forth, but I think you get some really nice colours this way. So I'm going to try and finish it with glazes of Screamer Pink, and just try and blend these highlights in, and I might get a little bit of the scale purple too. But yeah, we're almost there. Just been a little bit back and forth, but I always think that's the best way to get nice results, is to just keep adjusting until you like it. So this glaze and trying to get the mid-tone back because we just have the shadow and that desaturated light. So if I go across the shadow and the bottom, the highlight, you can see that will bridge the gap between them. And that's what we want. Now we've got intense light, mid-tone, and then the shadow. That is looking pretty cool to me. And this one needs adjusting, doesn't it? This has worked really well. We've got really nice intense light here, loads of strong mid-tone, and then it drops into that shadow. Just going to glaze that highlight in the bottom. So I'm going to let that dry, maybe do another pass or two, but yeah, looking like we've got there. So all I've done between the last step and here is actually give it an AK Ultra Matte varnish all over. And it was getting pretty glossy from all the glazing and the Games Workshop paints with Vallejo thinner mixed in. Sometimes that does come out a little glossy. So this has given it a really even finish, and I think Ultra Matte is really nice for cloth. As I explain later, I only varnish the cloak. I don't use it for the rest of the model because I think that's fine to have a satin finish from the paint, but it is really nice to see this cloak in matte, and that helps give it the soft kind of clothy satin feel. So I think that's a really great thing to do. That's actually the cloak finished. So what I want to end with is a summary of what I think you should do to recreate this, or what I would do if I was starting from scratch. So to summarize, the suggestion I have for the process, if you approach it, is to pre-highlight with black and white, as we've shown. Then we're going to do the Screamer Pink, just like we followed in the video, all over. Then with the shadows, we're going to just add black red straight into the Screamer Pink. So at this point, we've almost followed it how I've shown, but we've ditched that scale paint, just simplified it by adding black red to Screamer Pink. After we finish the shadows, we'll add Screamer Pink back into the airbrush and start to gradually add a little bit of ivory or just plain white. Then we're going to build up those highlights, not going too bright to get a nice soft highlight. Then the final stage will be to do a glaze of Screamer Pink, and that will tie everything together, softening the lights, tying the shadows into the mid-tone. This should be really diluted, but it will bring everything together. Finally, something that's really important for the look I managed to achieve in the end is the use of AK Ultra Matte Varnish. By all the different layers of airbrushing and glazing and the use of airbrush thinner, you'll probably have quite a satin effect and certainly not an even effect. So one of the reasons the cloak looks so soft is because I did ultra matte varnish the entire thing, and that made everything look really nicely blended. The super matte finish really shows off the transitions, and I didn't use any varnish on the rest of the figure. So all the non-metallic elements are completely painted by hand, just with the brush, and I didn't do any varnish on those. I just left them the satin finish of the brushed on paint. So yeah, but that ultra matte varnish is really important for the cloak. I hope that this summary has helped you make sense of all the footage. I wanted to show you my complete process of trial and error because I think it's better for you for your learning and seeing some things, but with this little concise summary at the end, you can use that to do the painting yourself. So everyone, I hope you enjoyed that process. I hope that it seems nice and simple, and you can get an amazing result by just taking your time and learning to get to grips with your airbrush. In the next one, we are going to tackle finally the non-metallic elements, the silver and the gold. That'll definitely be the longest of this video series, and perhaps the one you're looking forward to the most. But in the end, we're going to get a fantastic figure, and I hope that you're enjoying this series. So until then, I will see you